Hi everybody, welcome to the Rare Book Room in Kent Library. Today we are going to be talking about and looking at some medieval manuscripts that we've been fortunate enough here to start collecting. But we want to provide a little background info for you first. The Rare Book Room was essentially kind of established and built out when the library went through a really big renovation in the mid-1960s here. And they carved out this little bit of space for Charles Harrison's rare books to be put in here first. He was an early benefactor to the university, and he collected about 800 rare and unusual books, and he did a really great job of collecting. It's quite an eclectic collection. He liked books that had beautiful bindings, books as art pieces. He has a really well-developed medieval collection, which actually kind of encouraged us to want to add to that collection. We have a really active couple medievalists on campus, Dr. Joni Hand out of the art department and Dr. Vicky McAlister out of the Department of History and Anthropology. And they had used the books, the medieval manuscripts and pieces in Harrison's collection quite a bit in their classes. And so just a few years ago, the Special Collections and Archives had got some money to purchase whatever we would like to add to the collection, which had been a first for us. We had never had money to actually buy things, so that was quite exciting. And we kind of put our heads together collectively and thought, why don't we try adding some medieval fragments and leaves to the collection that already exists so that we can continue teaching and using it as we go here. So today we'll be looking at a few pieces within Harrison's collection that kind of, like I said, spurred us on to collect the larger and develop the larger teaching collection that we have here today. And we'll spend some time looking at those pieces there as well.
Hello, I'm Dr. Joni Hand. I am Associate Professor of Art History in the Department of Art and Design. My research focuses around the late Middle Ages and particularly books of hours, religious devotional books, and materiality. Okay, so anyway, Gregory the Ninth, was the author of not necessarily this particular version of the decretals, but he was one of the doctors of the church.
So this is just basically a book on church teachings.
Yes.
I mean, that's
glossed,
way too general, but
yeah, and it's been glossed, and so there are other commentaries within this larger commentary. It's a book for learning, like a textbook, to understand the teachings of the church. So yeah, like Vicky was saying, the flyleaf has been, if you go back to this has been recycled from another manuscript, so you see that the text is going this way. So this was not thought of as being as valuable as the text that is now protecting. Also, the beginning of the manuscript has been cut out, so you can see that these little tabs are still there. Most likely because, well, it was the introductory letter that introduced the decretals, and it probably had a really wonderful big illuminated letter. And so oftentimes those things were vampired out of manuscripts because they can make more money selling them individually rather than in an entire manuscript. So you can see that the alternating colors of the letters, it's to help you follow along. Also, this is written on vellum, which is an animal skin, and you can actually see some of the little follicles and some of the imperfections in the text. There's some interesting things here too. These little dots, these are actually little prickings, and they were used to rule the page, so that then the scribe could write, not all wiggly and wonky, and so have a nice little page, kind of like a notebook paper, right? So you had to create your own there. If we go back to the beginning, one of the things that is bothersome when you start looking at the Harrison collection is that he liked to put his bookplate on top of really important information that could help you understand the provenance of the book. So this is his bookplate, and you can see underneath here, it would be nice to be able to see all of that information. And in order to do that, we'd have to have somebody come in and take that off carefully.
let's see, somebody maybe sort of tried at some point to get some stuff off.
Not very successfully. So then oftentimes he would have information that he would sometimes type up or cut out of a auction catalog and glue that into the book as well.
And this being a student text, Dr. Hand, it's not necessarily, they didn't use the best quality materials, probably, perhaps, right? Like some of this vellum is probably a little bit lower quality. It's not very uniform. The pages kind of change from lighter to darker in color.
And an interesting thing about textbooks like this, and I can't tell if this was the case with this book, but students, they were poor in the Middle Ages too, and so it was really hard for them to purchase an entire book. So what they started to do, especially in Italy, was what's called the Peccia system, where you can actually borrow pieces of a book from a bookseller, and then go home, copy that little section, take that piece back, then get the next section of the book, come take that home, copy it, and so on. That ensured, first of all, that the students could get the manuscripts cheaper, and also it established continuity with the texts, so that there was at least a little bit of, unless you were a bad scribe and didn't copy it correctly. But yeah, there was an attempt to do that at least.
And we believe, Dr. Hand, this is probably the oldest piece in Charles Harrison's collection?
Yeah, in his collection.
Probably the oldest kind of full manuscript that we have. You can see it's lived a lot of lives. Mm-hmm. This is obviously nowhere near any kind of original binding. It's not even bound together anymore. This was added in much later. That's a much newer type of binding, and they've talked about the fly leaves as well. So, but this is, like as Dr. Hand just mentioned, it's a really valuable piece, and it did kind of kickstart and get us thinking about what else can we add, what else can we use those allocation monies that the library has given us to kind of develop and further flesh out the collection.
Right.
So that's that piece.
This is one of my favorites.
This is probably one of the highlights of the whole Harrison collection.
So Book of Hours is basically a little kind of a manual for prayer for individuals. These are private devotional manuscripts, and they were called the bestsellers of the Middle Ages, because if you had a book, if you could afford a book, this would be the book that you would have. It starts with a calendar, as you can see where Roxy is here, that would alert you to the feast days of the year and the importance of those feast days too. And you can see that some of them are in red, some of them are in this, which would have been black. It's kind of faded here. So it tells you the importance then too. It's called the Book of Hours because all the prayers within it are divided into the canonical hours of the day. So that meaning that you'd have 8 segments of time during the day, and each prayer then you would say a certain part of it during those segments of the day. The first prayer is the Hours of the Virgin, and so you find those in all books of hours, and this has been taken apart. So you can see Roxy's kind of coming through it.
One of the things we really like to kind of show the students when we pull these pieces out is how different that first piece, the Decretals, which was more of a student textbooks, looked compared to a Book of Hours from the period where it's much more uniform. The vellum is all cut and nice, and the script is kind of much more centered.
And this book actually has been cut down, because if you start to look at some of the illuminations, you can see that it was at one point much larger than this. So you can see this is cut here. Each of the major prayers is kind of highlighted with an illumination like this. So that gives you, as the reader, kind of lets you know where you are in the manuscript, because they weren't numbered. There were no page numbers. When these were manufactured, when they were written in what are called choirs or gatherings, and so they were separate pieces. And oftentimes, I can't remember this guy catchwords, in order to understand how that's going to be put together at the end when it's bound, what they would do is they would, at the bottom of the last page of the choir, they would write the first word of the next choir. So it was kind of a little matching system, so you would understand how that would go.
And again, we're really fortunate that Harrison kind of focused on the medieval period as a point in his collecting, because I think Dr. Hand has researched a lot of this collection, and he paid about $50 for this piece.
Yeah, $50, and that was his budget for the month. So that was a huge deal for him that he spent that much money. I did some research on, there were a lot of letters written between Harrison and his main bookseller, book buyer. They became friends, and they hung out together and socialized and so on. So there's a lot of interesting things in those letters back and forth between the men, and talking about Harrison was very frugal, and so he was always questioning why is this so expensive? Why is this the quality of the piece that you're showing me not up to par compared to other pieces that I've seen? Or, because he would go to auctions and read auction catalogs and so on.
And he was doing a lot of his collecting in the Great Depression, the 1930s and then the early 40s before he passed away. So it probably was a time to be thinking conservatively about where your money's going. But
and the fact that he even had money to do that is pretty amazing. And I mean, like Roxy said, his collection has almost 800 pieces in it. So and they're manuscripts. They're all manuscripts. They're not fragments like we have for the teaching collection. So yeah, we are very lucky where we are, Southeast Missouri, to have, not only the Harrison collection, but of course the Faulkner collection. But we're not going to talk about that.
No Faulkner today. We'll do Faulkner another day.
Another day.
But that was kind of inspiring to us, I think, as we worked to put our heads together and figure out, well, we've got a little bit of money to spend now. I think our library dean, Barbara Glacken, started the archives with $5,000, and that's what we parlayed into our first purchase with the teaching collection, which is, again, going to be mostly fragments and leaves of medieval pieces. But we'd like to bring in Dr. Vicky McAlister, the Department of History and Anthropology, and she's going to maybe show or highlight a few of her favorite pieces, and then we can kind of talk about how we interact with the students, get the students to use the materials and what we've done with them from there.
I'm Dr. Vicky McAlister. I'm an Associate Professor in the Department of History and Anthropology here at Southeast Missouri State, and I specialise in the history and archaeology of the Middle Ages. So I've pulled out a few items that are kind of more unusual ones from a historical perspective from the teaching collection. So first off is actually now our oldest piece within the whole thing, and this is a manuscript fragment. This has come, this is from around the year 1100. And it is from a cut out of what we call an Atlantic Bible. So this thing originally would have been huge. It would have been really, really big. But as you can see, it's been kind of chopped out very roughly. If you can see the edges here, the reason that this has survived is because it was used as book backing, like in the decretals here. That is the fate of this. And we might go, oh, it's so sad to see it chopped up, and it is, but at least it ensured its survival into today. And then there are different groups today who are trying to piece back together these fragments and try and figure out if they can get a complete manuscript or close to it by figuring out where these bits cut out of them are all located and start assembling them. So this is our oldest piece in the whole collection. It's got damage. You can see it's got bits of paper still stuck to it from where it was used as book backing, essentially. The same as if you get a school textbook, you'd wrap it in brown paper to try and protect it. But we know that this is very old because of the type of handwriting that they've used. And that gives us an indication as to date. You'll notice as well that most of the items that we've talked about so far and we'll continue to talk about are religious in nature, and that reflects the society of the Middle Ages and who was, literacy was drastically increasing over the course of the Middle Ages. But certainly in the High Middle Ages, such as where this comes from, who was going to produce books, who was going to read books, it's going to be people within the church. So it's going to be things like Bibles, decretals. We've also got out of choir books, musical pieces for everybody to use in the Mass. And then it's kind of later on in the Middle Ages that we find a spread, more different types of texts. As more people are becoming literate, the costs come down and more people are demanding written material, which we also saw with the Book of Hours. So most of the content of what we've got is religious. We do have some, let me see. There's some that are wills, and
Looking at
I know I didn't pull them out, and yet now I find myself talking about them as being kind of lay examples of lay literacy.
piece about testifying in court.
Oh yeah, okay. So yeah, this is actually earlier lay literacy because I'm pretty sure this is an extract from Justinian's Juris, just to be honest. This is actually canon law. So this is church law. So even when we think about things today that would be secular, not church involved, like going to court, in the Middle Ages, big religious influence there. So this is for a church court. As Dr. Hand, the decretals, being students, were studying that. That's because the origins of universities as a whole, such as we're standing in today, came from within from the church. Originally, universities originated in places to train priests and other church members, and then more and more people wanted the type of education that they got to access other career opportunities. So that is it really does show how
pervasive
the church was in the Middle Ages.
This is the gloss piece on civil law.
Okay. Oh yeah. So this is from this is actually. It's really interesting and actually ties in really well with these pieces I've got here. It shows how we tend to think of medieval Europe as being very samey and very white, and it wasn't. Medieval, and a lot of people incorrectly call it the Dark Ages, and that is really later propaganda. It's really not right at all. And this piece is actually a really good indication of how different cultures in the medieval world communicated with one another. So this is actually from, it's civil law, it's 1238. I want to say it's Italian in origin, but I'm only guessing there. And it's a commentary. So the piece of civil law is this bit in the middle, and then all the stuff around it is like what a student, somebody studying it, needs to know about it. But this has come from the laws that the Byzantine Emperor Justinian codified back in the early Middle Ages, and Justinian was based in Constantinople, which is modern day Istanbul in Turkey. And he went back to the Roman law, standardized it, and that's what they did in the Byzantine Empire. And then later in the Middle Ages, this filtered its way westwards. They was translated out of the Greek. Actually, he had it in Latin, and then it was in Greek. And then we'll see how there's it's not just Latin in medieval texts. And this became something that you studied at university. Civil law, the type of law that we've got today. Church law becomes less important over time. So this is a really interesting piece to show how the content had, hundreds of years of shelf life as it was.
And I think what Dr. McAlister is saying too, Bologna was a center for the teaching of civil law. So her mentioning of this being Italian is probably pretty spot on, because that was where you would go if you were studying that.
Yeah, Bologna was the place to go if you wanted to study law. And my students love learning about Bologna in class, because Bologna had this really weird system where the students ruled the roost, and it was all student run. So if their professor didn't cover the syllabus the way they liked, they could fine the professor. If the professor wanted to leave campus, he had to post bail. So students love hearing about how the students ran the show at Bologna. They get a bit misty-eyed over it, but it didn't. So that system did not survive.
I think
very long.
Fortunate in how we collect too, because Dr. Hand's interests tend to be more from the art perspective, or looking at things that way. Dr. McAlister teaches a different aspect of that in terms of what daily life was like, what the laws were, things like that, agriculture, what people did. Mm-hmm. So they had a really good sense together of what would build and make a really well-rounded collection that both their classes could use. So we've got history students, we've got art students using the materials, which is really cool.
Yeah. Yes, you definitely notice. You could tell which ones that Dr. Hand picked out compared to the ones I picked out, because hers are pretty and mine are really mundane.
You had mentioned, I know this is probably slightly off topic, but we had mentioned a choir page.
Oh yeah, I think it's a good idea to show this.
Again, when we talk about the size of the pieces too, Dr. Hand made mention that our Book of Hours has been cut down and rebound to fit in new binding. This is a choir page here from about 1650. St. Gonzalo, does that sound correct?
That's right. Yeah, it's from if I remember correctly, I started to research this one. It's from suffrage, I think, or the mass dedicated to him. And one of the interesting things about this, it's gorgeous, it's big, it's a choir book, so you have to be able to see it.
Yeah.
So that's why they're so large.
They wouldn't have had their own individual ones. They
Right.
would have needed to be able to see, even if they were up at the back. So that's why it's so big.
Somebody sewed this little tab in, and it's got the name of the saint on it. So it's like a little, finder, like a Rolodex thingy, where you can just kind of, you can see that the name, and then it's been sewed in here.
Is it the same saint as depicted?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So that's really kind of fun, seeing how people, the DIY stuff and how they manipulated the text, because these were used. They had to be able to find these things quickly.
I think it's really interesting too, and it's another good connection with the students is when we see stuff in the marginalia of these pieces and in the margins of what other people have left or pointed to, maybe drew a little finger indicating that this is an important passage to remember, or there's animals in there. I mean, some of these are really heavily glossed, I guess, in the marginalia with different imagery and pieces, but that's what we tell students. That's sort of like highlighting today. If it was something important you needed to remember, you could point to it with a little finger that you drew, or now we have highlighters for that. But this is how they would have used it every day. That was to make their life easier, more accessible.
So the other ones that I pulled are from not just the medieval West, but how we're trying to diversify the collection as well, and emphasize the cultural contacts that existed in the medieval world. So this one is actually a medieval piece that has come from Egypt, and most of the texts that we've got are Latin, because Latin was the language of the learned classes in Christendom anyway. But it wasn't the only language. We've got French in some of our, and actually we do have a Flemish folio as well. But this is actually very neat in terms of diversifying what we've got, and therefore diversifying our curriculum too, in that it is actually in Coptic. So this has come from Egypt, and as you can see, it says on papyrus as well, or is it vellum? It doesn't look this.
I think it's vellum.
Okay.
I think so.
It's just well stained and well worn.
Actually, might be paper. I don't have my glasses on, so I can't really see. I don't see any.
No, it is paper. I think
I think
feeling
it's
it.
paper, yeah.
In which case, that also highlights how important cultural exchanges were in the Middle Ages, because as Dr. Hand showed, these pieces are on vellum, which is animal skin. Students were always amazed. They're imagining that it's going to be like a rug, and you turn like a page of a rug or something.
Like leather,
but
yeah.
or leather, yeah. But really, it's incredibly fine. It feels like thick parchment paper. But so paper is a later technology that reached medieval Western Europe. So this is really interesting from that perspective. That this is an early type of paper. The technology came from the East, from China. Now the downside to this piece is it's great to have it. It shows a different cultural tradition, but we don't have anybody on campus who can read it. So that's kind of a longer term plan.
Latin.
Yeah.
It also has some Arabic on it too, someplace. I thought I was looking at it. But so this is also a religious text, but it's in Egypt. The Christianity was a kind of a derivative or a different way of practicing Christianity called Coptic. Was it Coptic Christianity, or is it?
Yeah, because it was big. Yeah, they're. Long story short, Christianity was once whole, and then it got so popular it started to split. And you had patriarchs in each of the 5 major Roman cities, one of them being Alexandria in Egypt, and then that over time developed into the Coptic Church.
In that centralized system, it was very difficult to maintain, and so you have pockets of people worshiping in slightly different ways.
It's really interesting to me because this, I'll give a little bit of background about how we use the students to build the collection too, but this was a very popular piece with the students. I know both groups in your classes had wanted to buy this piece. When we had started kind of, and Drs. Hand and McAlister wanted to use the Harrison pieces in their teaching, we were doing a lot of show and tell. It was, here students, come look at this, but don't touch. It was very kind of formal and probably pretty stuffy and frankly a little boring for them. We
Oh no,
started,
they loved it though.
You
They
think
still
they
loved it. Oh yeah, no, they did. They did.
we decided that after I attended a few conferences, I was seeing people do really cool active learning exercises with students in manuscripts. And I reached out to some colleagues. They shared some of their thought processes with us, and we developed a handout that really kind of breaks students in the class into groups. They each assigned one of the manuscripts, generally from Harrison's collection, and then they have to go through their worksheet. What language is this? What is your book about if you can figure it out? What year do you think this is from? What is this made of? How did they make it? So they're kind of guided through this worksheet, and they are allowed to handle it kind of as much as they want. We're all always there to oversee and make sure they don't get too nervous handling some of these things, but it's really interesting to see that, vellum from this period lasts a lot better than paper from 1970. Mm-hmm. So they're actually in really good shape. If we had a piece that we thought was too fragile, we wouldn't be able to use it with those types of exercises. But as we started to continually work with the classes, and it kind of got picked up and more noticed, that's when our dean started giving the archives a little bit of allocation dollars. So we started with the $5,000, and like I said, the three of us put our heads together to figure out how we can do that. The first few years, we just bought the pieces, I think, ourselves. I asked you to come. We met with a few dealers, and then the pieces were selected based on their teaching interests and the curriculum. After that, we got the last round was just earlier this year, actually.
Right before COVID hit.
Yeah, it feels like a lifetime ago.
It was Valentine's Day, remember?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. We did the activity, but we wanted to involve the students in that part of the process. We were graciously given $12,000 from the library funds to enhance this collection. And so Drs. Hand and McAlister, thankfully, each had a class running in spring of 2020, and each class got $4,000, and they were given kind of sort of a list of material. We have a really good relationship with a dealer of these pieces. He comes down from Chicago to work with us. So he brought backpacks and briefcases full of manuscripts and leaves and fragments, and he just kind of spread them out down at a big classroom in the River campus. And the professors each worked with their classes to figure out what do we want to buy. They had to kind of look and understand what was already in the collection and what we hope to do. And then they had to go through and look what this dealer had kind of presented to us and make the justifications and arguments for what they thought was interesting to purchase. And if possible, you guys should each talk about how the classes made their selections. But I remember this Coptic piece being very sought after between both groups of students. So, Dr. McAlister, how did your group, how did they make the decisions on what to purchase?
Well, my class that I was teaching that got involved was my class on Crusades and Culture Contacts. So they were like, oh, with this, because it tied in so clearly to what we were doing in class and everything religious as well. So I had it so that the students had to write an argument paper, persuasion paper, on an item that they felt was the most important. They had to pick one, which they were not happy about, in a good way, because they thought that so much was important. But they had to pick one and then write a paper about why the library should spend its money on it, why it was important, what it was going to add to the collection. So it had a place within the collection and also the historical context. And then we kind of did a recreation in a way of how medieval students were taught, called a disputation, which is like a form of debate. And that does go back to the fact that medieval students did not have access to a lot of materials, like Dr. Hand said. So if students are cramming for exams today, they've got their note cards and, they've got all these different apps. But back in the Middle Ages, examinations were oral. Students had to memorize. And so a big part of their learning and their way of remembering things was to practice through debates, called a disputation. So we held like a mock disputation, a very heavily adapted one, where the students had to argue in this medieval format to a panel of judges composed of different faculty why their item was the most important. And they also prepared a rubric for the panel. Like they said, right, this is what we want, this is what we think are the most important things to consider. And so that was really fun. That was competitive in a really nice way. They got very, very fired up and very personally invested on making sure that their piece was well argued for. And they could also band together together in little groups. A lot of them had common interests. So this was a popular one.
Some of the more artifact pieces were really popular.
Yes, and this one too was very popular. This is a later one from circa 1700. Oh dear, it's wrapped up. It's actually a Persian poetry book. So again, it tied in really well with a lot of the themes that we were talking about in class. So I remember students, this was one of the ones that my class argued for as being a more secular piece, and also in another language that was not already well represented in the collection.
I think the students did a really thoughtful job about considering what we had, what would be useful and beneficial for students going forward, and they took it really seriously. It was my intention kind of as an archivist and librarian to put them in the driver's seat a little bit. I want them to kind of think about and understand, how did this stuff get here? Why is this here? So you can talk a lot about Harrison. He donated a whole collection, but now we're in the position where we can add pieces. And they got to be part of that, which I think we all really liked. It was really cool. This was another recent purchase from earlier this spring. It is a ring from roughly about maybe 1100. But that was another piece that the students selected. And it was really nice because the dealer who came down brought different artifact pieces too, so they were not just looking at fragments and leaves, things like that. Dr. Hand, do you mind talking about your class exercise and how they sort of made the selections?
So I was teaching medieval art, so this is more of a visual kind of process. And what I did, I prepared the students because, a lot of them, the art classes that they had were very general. So they didn't really have a focus, and it was at the beginning of the semester, so they didn't have any background yet. So the week before we had our meeting, I went over materiality, how books were put together, the different materials that were used, kind of like a crash course in bookmaking, basically. And so that prepared them. But not really, because when we all came into the room and there were these materials spread out, it was one of the most wonderful teaching moments for me, because you just saw them, and then when they started they were so afraid to pick things up, and we were like, no, it's okay, you can do this. And for them to have that experience was really wonderful. Then when they were looking at the prices of things, that was another kind of eye-opening thing. And then when they got together and tried to figure out what our budget was and so on. So what I did when we got into the room, I had a little form for them to fill out, kind of what Roxy was talking about, where they had to, what's the year? Do you know what's the material? The material that it's made out of. What can you say about it? Based on the information that is in front of you, and also things that we talked about previous. What it was used for, those kinds of things, kind of a list of things. And then finally, it was the rationale. Why should we buy this for the teaching collection? And I collected those, and I kind of glanced at them, but we made our decision right there. We got together as a group. Dr. McAlister's students were, looking through. It was great. It was such a great space and a great vibe in the room.
Did you find that your students, gravitated toward the same pieces a lot when you met in the group, or were they pretty?
There were definitely favorites.
Really?
Yeah, which was a good thing, because I was thinking, we can't buy all these things, and so there's certain students are going to be a little upset by not being able to have their piece chosen. But it worked out pretty well. I thought there were just one or two things that we weren't able to add. But luckily, the man that we were dealing with was very generous, and he had a tendency to kind of throw something else into the pot. So it was really nice.
University discount.
Yeah, that's right. He was wonderful. So then what they did, kind of the follow-up for that, was the piece that they chose individually to purchase, they had to research and then write a paper on. And those, I think, were some of the best papers I've ever had from students, because they were personally invested in the material and the project. You could tell that there was enthusiasm and definitely interest in it. And I'm teaching. What am I teaching? I'm teaching I'm teaching Northern Renaissance art now, and so it's very easy to link that to what we're learning in class. And I just had them basically do the same thing. They came to the library, picked out an item. They're not buying them, but these are items already purchased. researched them in the library, and they just turned their papers in this week. So I'm excited to read about them. And it's this.
They were a great group. Sorry to interrupt you again, but they were able to look at the past like 3 or 4 years that we've done this. They were able to look at each collection, so it didn't have to be the most recent set of materials that were purchased. They could go back a few years, but they really were excited every time they picked up another fragment. They had to measure it. You know, they had to figure out what it is, where did this come from, and then they had to figure out how easy is this going to be for me to research necessarily. Like, I imagine there's some harder pieces in there that there's not a lot to find out about. So they kind of had to use their evaluation skills to figure out, is this going to be something I can find enough information on for a paper?
Exactly. I've been writing about this collection, but it's so enormous now. It's just taking a long time to do that. So I have some information about some of the pieces, the early pieces that we purchased, but some of the things like the Persian pieces are a little more, and that Coptic thing, I don't even... Yeah, that's going to be tough. It's tough. It's beautiful to look at, but in terms of research, it takes a while. I wanted to talk about these because these are really fun. These are pilgrims' badges. I don't know if you can get that without the glare. I can take it out.
They're still in remarkably good shape for being as old as they are, just in bits of metal.
Yeah. And I like the fact that they're both pilgrims' badges, but they're very different. This one's from England, and this one is probably from Spain. Pilgrimage was another way to do a lot of things, to show your faith, to atone for sins, to, hopefully get cures for someone who's ill, whatever. And just like tourists today, when you would go on a pilgrimage, there were many places that you could go. And when you would go there, oftentimes you could collect one of these little badges, and you could sew it on your clothing, sew it on your beret, on your hat. Yeah, or in your books too. A lot of people would actually sew them or attach them into their private devotional manuscripts. So this one, I'll just talk about this one quickly. This is in the shape of a scallop shell. It's kind of damaged, but that became kind of the universal symbol for pilgrimage because it's linked to Santiago de Compostela, which is the Church of St. James in Spain, and this was one of the primary pilgrimage sites to go to. So the idea of pilgrimage as a whole, eventually this was the symbol that kind of represented that. This one is from England. It's the letter M for Mary. It's specifically from a pilgrimage site that was attracted to people that were interested in St. Thomas Becket, and so it became a hub for, again, people that admired him and wanted to, pay homage to him. So 2 of my students are working on these, and so I'm very excited to read the papers and see what they found out. Most of them are kind of vampiring my information that I wrote, but that's okay. I just want to see how they frame it, so that'll be really interesting for me.
The stuff can be relatable back to the students, though. I mean, that's kind of essentially like a souvenir someone would have purchased from that period.
Totally
so,
is. Yes.
I mean, they go on vacation, they take pictures, they buy souvenirs. This is what people did in the period.
And
it's really cool that we have them. They can hold them. They, can research them.
Well, we see a lot of images. Where's the one I was going to look at? Yeah, this one.
And a lot of people think that medieval people, especially peasants, they just stayed on their manor, they stayed in their village, they never left. They had this very closed worldview. And items like this show that this is incorrect. People did travel in the Middle Ages. They did want to see and understand the world around them.
And pilgrimage was really expensive too. So sometimes people would save up for a year or longer to go on a pilgrimage and it was extremely dangerous. You're walking on roads. There were bandits, always waiting to get you, and disease and illness and starvation. I mean, all kinds of things. So
probably a little harder than we think of taking a vacation now, which you might have to save for.
Yeah.
But that
was part of the thrill for them,
right.
though.
Sure, trying to evade.
They overcame problems.
Yeah.
They were doing it to get an easier time in the afterlife.
That's
so
right.
you got to work for it.
This was a popular piece when we did the purchasing. This is a little anatomical kind of drawing, and it's just filled with symbolism. The astrology and reading the stars was really important to the medieval mind for a number of reasons, from medicinal purposes, for trying to figure out when a good time to do certain things would be. When should I When should I go on a pilgrimage? When is the safest time to do that? And a lot of it is based on what we think of as astrology now. I know that's like the superstition of that is kind of, I don't know, people think of it as a heretical kind of religion, but it was really important to the medieval mind. And this is a great illustration because it divides up the signs of the zodiac into 4 quadrants, and each of those signs then had a condition. Like if you were born under Libra, for instance, you had a tendency perhaps to be melancholic. Or if you decided to do something during when Libra was rising, certain bad things could happen, certain good things could happen, and so on. So it's really, really complicated. And then each of the signs of the zodiac are also associated with parts of the body. So that would, if you have a certain illness, it's probably because something happened or you did something when a certain sign was rising in the sky. So it's really fascinating, and the students.
I don't think there was one student who did not want to buy that piece.
Well, it has a skeleton on it, first of all. I mean, that was the first thing. But when they saw or kind of started to research all the other things about it and how fascinating it is, and we were talking about just like 2 weeks ago, Albrecht Dürer and his print Melancholia. And so we were talking about that idea of. Or how important, and he's not, for the Middle Ages, but still how important that was to figuring out the world around you and figuring out how to go about your day-to-day or even making large decisions. Was really, focused on other things. And so it is another interesting thing is it's not necessarily religious. So it's kind of and that's another thing about the Middle Ages. Yes, it was, very religious. People were following our religious standards, but they were also very superstitious, and there were a lot of regional, vernacular kinds of ideas that were floating around too. So it's kind of a little bit of everything, which I think is really fascinating.
I suppose it's worthwhile saying most of what we've shown here are manuscripts and that they're handwritten, but we do also have some printed materials because the printing press came to the fore in the middle of the 15th century.
Right.
And before that, everything had to be done by hand, and so students are always really impressed with how neat the handwriting is and tiny, and that things that are handwritten are more beautiful actually
Well,
than
that's
print
an
a lot of
important
the
point,
time.
what Dr. McAlister is saying, because this has both. This is printed, but then it's hand illuminated. So you have, kind of that transition from one way of thinking to another way of thinking. And even when the printing press took over, there were certain people that would want deluxe manuscripts in the manner of a manuscript, not a printed piece. So they may have it printed and then have it hand colored, or kind of have a hybrid version of this, what was a manuscript. So.
That brings us to another great point that I always try to reiterate with the students is I think especially students of certain generations take the internet for granted, right? You're born and it's here. I mean, that's a world-changing, life-changing invention, much as the press was in about 1450.
Right, yeah.
So we try to make those connections for students, like look what is happening now and how different and quickly information is created and disseminated versus how hard it was before that press came along. You had to kill your animal, make your vellum, handwrite everything out. All of a sudden the press kicks in, and it still takes a while. It's still definitely an art to create the book, but you can do it a lot faster and more efficiently and more effective, and it's only gotten obviously easier and better from there. So
It's around the same time the printing press that the paper technology reaches the western parts of Europe as well. So the combination of the two is really what they set each other off.
It made the world very small.
Yeah, very quickly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
other things we should talk about and discuss.
Do you all have a favorite piece? Have you talked about it already? I know it's like picking your favorite child.
Yeah.
My favorite piece is the one that I'm researching at that moment.
Is it really?
Yeah, because it's like I get so involved with it, and,
Yeah,
and then I'm going this way and this way, all these rabbit holes. And
You're amazing. You find Dr. Hand can find the original auction catalog listings sometimes where some of these things were picked up and
I like
purchased.
doing
And
research.
it's
I'm a nerd.
It's a lot of historical background that she has to do to get to how this piece came to us today. There's a great piece in Harrison's collection that's probably his earliest printed book from 1494. And that was actually stamped. that has a great history in that book. It was stamped by a public library, so at some point a public library had owned the piece. And
Italy, yeah.
yeah, Dr. Hand was able to follow its, all the way till probably when, I'm assuming Harrison's book buyer for him went and brought it back, or selected that piece for him.
Yeah, I mean, I did track down a lot of auction catalogs and finding exactly, or where did this, or what collection did this piece come from? Because oftentimes, when things go to auction, it's a collection from some other person, and then it gets all split up. So if you can find out what the lot number or the person that it came from, you can get a ton of information, and then that leads you down another little wormhole, right, into something else.
But again, another great teaching point for the students was thinking about how many lives these pieces have led. It's hard sometimes to get students to think about 10 years from now, much less, what's going to happen in the next 100 years. Well, what has happened since the creation of this piece or this book, which has now been with us for 700 years, It's really interesting to try to get them to think about that as well.